Hello. Al Capone is regarded as the most notorious gangster in history and one of the leading figures during the Prohibition era in the United States in the 1920s. The man known as Scarface has inspired countless films, books, and documentaries, shaping the Mafia image we recognize today. Today's story will take us deep into the complex criminal life of Al Capone, from the impoverished alleys of the Brooklyn slums to the luxurious and powerful lifestyle of a gangster. Capone hired up to 1,000 gunmen and bribed nearly half of the city's police force. The purpose of this story is to recount historical events, provide information, and educate rather than glorify or romanticize criminal activities. Al Capone's real name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, born in 1899 in New York's Brooklyn neighborhood. His parents were Italian immigrants who came to the U.S. in search of a better future for their children. Al Capone's father, Gabriel Capone, was a barber, while his mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. Despite living in difficult conditions, but they worked hard to raise their 9 children. Like most immigrant families of that time, the Capone family had to work tirelessly to make a living, always obeying the law and striving to integrate into their new country despite language, cultural, and religious barriers. Al Capone grew up in a poor slum riddled with crime and poverty in Brooklyn, which profoundly influenced his character. He quickly developed a brutal and violent demeanor. At the age of 14, he formed his first gang, called the Navy Street Gang, named after the neighborhood where he lived. This gang was created to fight against harassment of Italian women by Irish boys. As the leader, Capone quickly displayed his innate leadership skills, which would follow him throughout his life. By the age of 19, Capone married Mary Coughlin, an Irish girl he met at a bar, and the couple later had one child named Albert Francis. At this time, Capone's future was quite uncertain because after dropping out of school at an early age, he had no choice but to earn a living on the streets to support his family. It was during his frequent visits to bars in New York that Al Capone began to interact with notorious mobsters and gradually stepped into the world of organized crime. Here, Capone successfully joined a new gang that included famous gangsters like Johnny Torrio, Frankie Yale, and Lucky Luciano. From these men, Capone learned and began to delve deeper into New York's underground world. Capone started his criminal career when he was hired by Frankie Yale to work at a business that was both a bar and a brothel called Harvard Inn. Capone's main job was to collect money from customers, threaten them with violence if necessary, and control the flow of money from the prostitutes to prevent embezzlement. In other words, Capone was the protector of this bar. Fights and even murders became commonplace, and Capone gradually immersed himself in that violent atmosphere. Before long, he had crafted his legend with the nickname Scarface, a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. As he grew more accustomed to his new position, Capone gained increasing respect from his colleagues. He became a bartender at Frankie Yale's bar, and it was during this time that Capone received his famous scar. According to reports, Capone met a girl at the bar and flirted with her, even uttering some insulting remarks. The girl bluntly rejected him and then complained to her brother, a gangster named Frank Galluccio. Drunk and angry, Frank pulled out a bottle opener and attacked Capone. Although Capone managed to dodge most of the blows, but he was still slashed with 2 cuts on his cheek, one of which stretched from his ear to his mouth. That deep scar embarrassed Capone, and he always tried to hide it. However, it ultimately became a defining mark associated with his image throughout his life. Incredibly, Al Capone once attempted to distance himself from the world of organized crime after marrying Mary Coughlin. He desired a respectable life to protect his family, which was reflected in his decision to leave Frankie Yale's bar and move to Baltimore, where he found work as an accountant. This opportunity allowed him to develop financial management skills, which would later become crucial during Prohibition when he controlled millions of dollars. However, Capone's normal life did not last long. On November 14th, 1920, his father passed away from a heart attack, forcing him to return to New York and fall back into criminal associations. Once he was back in the underworld, Capone quickly gained a reputation as a thug who was not afraid to use violence, even willing to kill if necessary. There were rumors that he had killed a prostitute suspected of embezzling money or even murdered a friend for not paying at the bar where he worked. Capone's cold-bloodedness and violence made many in the gang unhappy, including Frankie Yale and Lucky Luciano. To avoid police attention, they decided to temporarily move Capone out of the city to calm the situation and protect the gang from judicial scrutiny. Al Capone's task was to join Johnny Torrio's gang in Chicago, as Torrio needed someone he could trust to assist him in complex criminal activities, and Capone was exactly the person he was looking for. Receiving $2,000 from Lucky Luciano, Capone took the first train to Chicago, a place that would shape his legend. It was Torrio, the mentor who completely changed Capone's life. In 1921, amid Prohibition, when the production and consumption of alcohol were entirely banned in the U.S., Capone moved to Chicago with his family. He arrived with a single goal: to learn about organized crime mechanisms and rise to power in the criminal world. To achieve this, he placed his trust in Johnny Torrio, whom Capone quickly came to regard as his mentor. While working with Torrio, Capone realized that to advance in the underworld, he needed to use his intellect more than just relying on violence. He started with minor roles in low-end brothels and soon got promoted to bartender in one of Torrio's important bars. Like other bars, this place was not a cozy spot for drinking, as fights and murders occurred regularly. However, Capone proved very skilled in his job and even became Torrio's trusted right-hand man. At this point, Capone began earning significant money through activities such as bootlegging, prostitution, extortion, and sports betting, all of which generated enormous profits for the Mafia. Under Torrio's leadership, their crime empire exploded with a series of brothels and speakeasies popping up all over Chicago. But things did not last long when William E. Dever was elected as the new mayor of Chicago. Right upon taking office, he aimed to crack down on illegal gambling and bootlegging. Many bars were shut down, forcing gangsters like Capone and Torrio to leave Chicago. With no other option, they decided to relocate their operations to the suburbs in Cicero. In Cicero, Johnny Torrio planned to turn the city into the center of bootlegging and sports betting. Their goal was to expand their criminal activities and gain control over the entire city and its infrastructure. However, to achieve this, they needed to ensure that Republican candidate Joseph Z. Clenha won the upcoming election. Otherwise, all their operations would be disrupted. Thus, Capone's gang began a campaign to manipulate the election in favor of Clenha. Capone was not alone in this. He brought along his two brothers for support. On March 31st, 1924, Election Day, the gangsters used violence and guns to intimidate voters. They forced those going to vote to select Clenha, even escorting voters to the polling stations to ensure their ballots had Clenha's name. Those who refused to comply were threatened with being shot on the spot. The situation spiraled out of control, and honest voters sought help from Judge Edmund K. Uretsky in an effort to stop the manipulation. Noticing that tensions were escalating, Judge Edmund K. Uretsky immediately dispatched 70 undercover police officers to Cicero to mingle with the crowd and control the violent situation. As they exited their vehicles, the police encountered Frank Capone, Al Capone's brother, who was trying to draw a gun from his pocket, mistakenly thinking it was a raid by a rival gang. In the midst of the chaos, Frank Capone prepared for the worst, but before he could react, he was shot dead on the spot by the police. They opened fire on him, shooting relentlessly until they ran out of bullets, leaving his body riddled with holes. Despite this tragic incident, the riots continued until the voting concluded. Fortunately for Al Capone and Johnny Torrio, their election manipulation efforts were not in vain. Their supported candidate, Joseph Z. Clenha, was successfully re-elected, allowing their crime empire to continue expanding. Although the election victory was achieved, but the price paid was too high. Al Capone witnessed the tragic death of his brother, Frank Capone, less than a month after the chaotic election in Cicero. Al Capone and Torrio wasted no time in opening a new casino, raking in nearly $1.5 million in just the first year, a staggering amount at that time. Cicero quickly had over 150 casinos operating under their control, where alcohol continued to be served despite the ban. In the context of Prohibition, bootlegging became a hugely profitable venture. However, Italian gangs were not the only ones wanting to control this market. Other gangs, including Irish gangs, had been present long before and were not willing to give up their position easily. A bloody confrontation between factions began to erupt during Prohibition. The Irish gang, led by Dean O'Banion, attacked the Italian gang, who controlled a large portion of the bootlegging market. Their goal was clear: to eliminate Johnny Torrio at all costs. Although the Irish gang made several assassination attempts on Torrio, but all failed, giving Torrio the opportunity for revenge. On November 10th, 1924, about 5 months after the Irish gang's first attack, Dean O'Banion was killed in his flower shop, shot twice in the chest and twice in the neck. This assassination was carried out by 3 of Torrio's henchmen: Frankie Yale, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi. Although the Irish gang had eliminated their main rival, but they did not back down. O'Banion's death sparked a fierce revenge from them. In January 1925, 2 Irish gangsters, Hemi Weiss and Bugs Moran, plotted another assassination attempt on Torrio. This time their plan came close to success, nearly costing Torrio his life. Fortunately, he miraculously escaped death. After this incident, Torrio declared that he was fed up with the rampant violence in Chicago and decided to retire. He handed over control of the crime empire to Al Capone, who then became the official leader of the gang. Surprisingly, Capone did not take any revenge after the assassination attempt on Torrio. This may have been because he was busy dealing with another gang war with the Jenna family, a fearsome Sicilian mafia family that had caused him significant damage. Al Capone could not overlook the Irish gang, who were eager to avenge Dean O'Banion's death. To quench their thirst for revenge, Capone devised a plan to eliminate them. His first target was Hemi Weiss. Capone organized a team of 5 hitmen, including Frank Nitti, Antonia Cardo, Frank Diamond, Albert Anselmi, and John Scalise, with the mission to assassinate Weiss. On October 11th, 1926, Al Capone's hit squad prepared for the assassination by closely monitoring Hemi Weiss's movements for an entire week. They waited for the perfect moment to strike until the opportunity presented itself. When they saw Weiss step out of a store with 3 bodyguards, Capone's gunmen immediately opened fire, ruthlessly gunning him down. This was one of the most formidable rivals that Capone's gang had faced, and now Al Capone had only one thing left to do: eliminate Bugs Moran, the sole bootlegger in Chicago. In April 1927, former Chicago Mayor William H. Thompson was appointed again, bringing an advantage to Capone and his family. After 5 years of exile, he was finally able to return to their former headquarters. The new mayor turned a blind eye to organized crime, allowing the gangsters to expand their influence without police interference. At this point, Bugs Moran was the last obstacle standing between Capone and his total control of the market. Violent conflicts between Moran and Capone spread terror across the streets of Chicago. To end this war, Capone devised a plan. On February 14th, 1929, while vacationing at a villa in Florida, Capone ordered some of his men to go to one of Bugs Moran's warehouses, disguised as police officers. The hired hitmen ordered the 7 people present in the building to line up against the wall. They were quite confident and complied without hesitation, thinking this was just a routine check that would be resolved with a surprise bribe. However, Capone's gunmen unexpectedly opened fire, turning Moran's warehouse into a veritable slaughterhouse, with all 7 men killed on the spot. When identifying the bodies, Capone's men suddenly realized that Bugs Moran was not among them. In fact, he had managed to escape just minutes before when he saw the police arriving at the warehouse. However, Moran, who had miraculously survived the Valentine's Day massacre, was severely psychologically affected. He no longer wished to fight Al Capone, gradually distancing himself from large-scale heists and only engaging in petty thefts. His gangster career ended when he was arrested for a bank robbery. He died in 1957 while serving his sentence. In the end, Al Capone had eliminated all his rivals, and complete control over the underworld in Chicago became a reality. From January 16th to 19th, 1929, the first ever summit of organized crime in America was held. The country's top mafia bosses gathered in Atlantic City to discuss their future. Al Capone was present, particularly to keep an eye out for anyone who might try to double-cross him, escorted by major figures from the underworld such as Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and Willie Moretti. The purpose of this conference was to ease tensions among the various mafia families, thereby avoiding conflicts that could severely damage their business operations. However, at this conference, Capone was not well regarded. He was criticized for attracting too much media attention since the infamous Valentine's Day massacre. Consequently, he was advised to keep a low profile for a while. To hide away, Al Capone chose the most drastic solution: prison. On January 16th, after leaving the conference in Atlantic City, Capone arranged with the Philadelphia police to arrest him for carrying a weapon. For him, this was the only way to stay off the FBI's radar, an agency that was increasingly taking a serious interest in his activities. As a result, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison, a relatively light sentence that was later reduced. Capone believed that once he served his time, he could return to business as usual, but things were not that simple. The Valentine's Day massacre had seriously tarnished his image in the eyes of the media and the public. To regain his reputation, Al Capone frequently attended major sporting events such as boxing matches, baseball games, horse races, and dog races. At these events, he often appeared alongside politicians, who at the time were unashamed to be seen with him. However, they were also concerned about their own image as the government sought to eliminate organized crime in Chicago. Capone did his best to showcase himself, and at that time, he was generating nearly $120 million in revenue annually, equivalent to about $1.5 billion today. By then, money was no longer what he needed, so Capone invested time in restoring his reputation by spending on helping the poor, especially during the Great Depression of 1929. He opened a soup kitchen to provide free meals for the destitute and homeless. For him, this was a way to get closer to the people and the working class. His goal was to build an image as a Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. However, this phony charity only bought him time and attention from the media, although it didn't last long. After the Valentine's Day massacre, Al Capone shocked public opinion, particularly with the way his men coldly eliminated Bugs Moran's gang. The case received widespread media coverage and stirred public sentiment. Capone's public appearances and charitable activities did not change the situation. He had reached a point of no return. The government had made its choice. They wanted to take down Capone, who had become their #1 enemy. However, taking him down in Chicago was very complicated because, at the height of his power, Capone was so influential that even the law could do nothing against him. At that time, Al Capone's army was stronger than the Chicago police, and even the county authorities could not bring him to trial for the horrific crimes attributed to him, such as bootlegging, extortion, pimping, gambling, and murder, all without any evidence. The entire country believed Capone was a criminal, but no one could prove it. Even Eliot Ness, a famous agent in the fight against Prohibition at that time, could not find evidence to convict Capone. The government and the FBI had no choice but to seek an alternative solution. The government believed that the best way to put Capone behind bars was to prosecute him for tax evasion, which would provide a legitimate charge for the authorities. Although Capone held millions of dollars, but no tax returns had been filed under his name. The government then discovered a loophole and immediately exploited it, assigning a team of agents from the Treasury Department to gather evidence to take down the Chicago kingpin. In 1931, an accountant named Frank J. Wilson uncovered solid evidence regarding one of Al Capone's income sources. This income stemmed from several gambling registrations that included Capone's name. On June 5, 1931, he was indicted for tax fraud, and his trial began on October 6, 1931 in federal court in Chicago. This was an internationally significant trial with media coverage from around the world unprecedented for such an event. It was not just a simple trial, but a confrontation between the entire United States and a notorious gangster. During the trial, Capone was not worried. He believed he could be sentenced to a maximum of 2 years in prison if he pleaded guilty before the judges. As soon as the jurors were selected, Capone, as usual, attempted to bribe them. However, things were no longer as straightforward as before. The jurors were replaced at the last minute, and from that point, the trial took a completely different direction. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Capone guilty of tax fraud. 6 days later, the sentence was handed down. The gangster was sentenced to 11 years in prison, an unusual sentence since, at that time, tax evasion rarely exceeded 2 years. Al Capone was transferred to Cook County Jail. His time there was relatively comfortable and pleasant. He had a private cell with a shower, access to a phone, and even a means to transfer money remotely. His henchmen and political friends could visit him whenever he wanted, and during that time, everything seemed to be going well. He was enjoying peaceful days in prison. However, karma began to catch up with him. The life of the most famous gangster in America began to enter its darkest phase as an illness ravaged his physical and mental health. Doctors diagnosed him with syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that he likely contracted in his youth while engaging with prostitutes. He then received news that he was being transferred to Atlanta Prison, a much stricter facility. At the age of 33, his health continued to decline as the syphilis reached its third stage, leading to gradual cognitive impairment affecting him. However, his nightmare was not yet over. In August 1934, he was transferred to another prison, the federal penitentiary at Alcatraz, which the government created to house the most dangerous criminals in the country. Here, visits were limited to once a month. Physical contact with visitors was prohibited, and radios, newspapers, and reading materials were not allowed. Work in the prison was a privilege, not a right, and inmates were isolated in small cells, unable to communicate with other prisoners, with no way to escape. Thus, Capone had no choice but to continue serving his sentence in this extremely strict prison. The syphilis was taking a toll on him faster than expected as his condition worsened, and doctors were compelled to move Capone to the hospital. His dire state led to his permanent departure from Alcatraz. Capone spent his final years in his Florida mansion surrounded by family. At this point, he was merely a shadow of his former self with a personality resembling that of a 12-year-old, causing him to constantly confuse illusion with reality. Finally, on January 25th, 1947, Al Capone, nicknamed Scarface, died of a heart attack at the age of 48. This concludes today's story, intended to inform and educate without glorifying or romanticizing criminal activities. What do you think of this story? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below so others can see. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support me. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.